Hello, everyone. My name is Keith Parent, and I am the CEO of Court Square Group. We are a managed service firm, and this is the Driving the Business of Science podcast. We started this podcast for a reason, in the fact that I felt that I met a lot of very interesting people in the course of our business. And as a life science company, everybody thinks about scientists in an office or in a lab somewhere, developing a new drug product or a biologic or something like that. But there's just so many different facets to this business that I thought, let's have a podcast and talk to different people about what they do in this business and why it's such a wide variety of topics. With that being said, so Court Square is a managed service firm. We manage IT infrastructure for life science companies. We have what's called ARC. It's an audit-ready compliant cloud, and we can host and manage any application all the way from preclinical through manufacturing. With that being said, we also have created a tool that we call RegDocs 365, which is a content repository that hosts clinical and regulatory content. We started out with a TMF and EDM reference model, and then have built what we call a life science launchpad to help those companies get off the ground, get a governance model put in place, and understand how to scale a company very well from an IT perspective. Today, we have a very interesting person that's going to be on the podcast. Her name is Jenna Rouse. She is the global head of clinical operations for Simulations Plus with their product Proficiency. And I'm going to have her talk a lot about that and the difference between the two. And Jenna, I've known Jenna for many, many years. We've gone to a lot of shows together, and I thought she'd be a great person to have on the podcast. So, Jenna, I'm going to turn it over to you and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Keith. I appreciate you having me on your podcast. You're right. We've known each other for several years, and it has always been interesting conversations about what you've been up to. I am, as you mentioned, I'm the global head of clinical operations at Simulations Plus. It's been a bit of a journey getting here. I spent about 16 years of my early career in clinical research with ACRP. I was leading some of their business-to-business operations, as well as competency development, marketing, membership, quite a bit in that space. And I was really honored to be able to work with a lot of sites and sponsors and CROs and how they're developing their workforce. I had the opportunity to experience Proficiency, which you can see from the logo here. I had the honor of experiencing Proficiency while I was with ACRP, and I saw how impactful a more elevated level of learning was with sites and sponsors and CROs, all of them really eager to get more analytics and data out of that investment. I made the decision to move over to Proficiency, and I've been with that solution for nearly 6 years now. So we're looking at 21 years in total in clinical research and education specifically. Proficiency was acquired by Simulations Plus about a year and a half ago. And now we're part of a larger organization that uses simulation in many different ways. So the legacy SLP, Simulations Plus organization, is really deep in the biosimulation, that data modeling approach within life sciences. But the Proficiency solution, which I represent, really focuses in on how we can simulate real life scenarios for sites in their operations of the protocol. So we do protocol specific training. And it's a way of providing an environment that they can make mistakes in instead of with the patient. And this is a form of learning that's really common in every other high risk industry. Astronauts, pilots, physicians, we all use simulation to practice before you're in a high risk situation. And in clinical research, the risk is in making the wrong protocol non-compliant decision. So we allow sites to practice that within our environment. They get better learning. They get a more experiential approach to protocol specific training, which sites love. But then also sponsors and CROs are getting data back that's actually performance based, what sites are actually doing that can let them be more risk based in their approach to remediation with the sites, how they're looking at their protocol, do they need to change the design? And it gives them some insights that help them drive quality on their study from the start before they start seeing deviations roll in. So I'm really passionate about this being the right way of going into a study. But there certainly are challenges. We're coming into a study at the absolute most busy time of any study, and asking them to make some changes, which is a challenge in the way that business is run. But never have we ever had a sponsor say, this is just okay. Once you start doing it this way, it really is the way that you start doing training for all of your studies and all of your different efforts. So it's been a really fruitful solution, both for us as well as for our clients and our partners. So I'm
That
excited to
sounds
talk
fun,
more about it.
fantastic. I didn't
Thanks.
realize your background in ACRP. So I'm assuming
Yeah,
that's the Association for Clinical Research Professionals.
it is. Yep,
Just so people understand, we have all sorts of acronyms in this industry, and
we do.
want to make sure everybody knows who that is and what that's all about. And it's interesting that you found out about proficiency from ACRP. Did you guys use
Mm-hmm.
proficiency as a training mechanism for what you guys were doing, or was that, did they join
Yeah.
ACRP as a vendor?
So ACRP for a point in time, and not any longer, but for a point in time, they were using Proficiency for a selection of the training modules like GCP. Proficiency now provides that GCP program through SCRS, through that model. So there's been a bit of a shift there. ACRP is still very dedicated to quality and developing that core competency, and I highly recommend them as an organization. They've just taken a different path in how they want to deliver that in an efficient, cost-efficient way for their members.
Great. Prior to us
Yeah.
getting on for this podcast, we were talking a little bit, and it was a little bit about our history and the proficiency versus simulation plus and things like that, and the fact that simulation plus, I'm fascinated by the fact that simulation plus was already doing some biosimulations and things like that, but I don't think people realize, and I as in this industry, I didn't realize how siloed we were in our thinking sometime when you think about different aspects of the works. And when you think about the preclinical world and you think about that early development and early stage stuff, there's a whole mindset around that. There's a whole different group of people dealing with that. It's more academic. But then once you start getting into the clinical area, that's when all of a sudden it changes. Tell me a little bit about that and some of the learnings that maybe Simulations Plus has had to deal with in working with proficiency.
Yeah, there are definitely different approaches and different models from that preclinical space. And I agree with you. It's interesting how much of a split there is. Like this team does this part, and then even from a protocol perspective, someone's crafting and writing the protocol. Largely like mid to large size companies. Some of the smaller companies operate differently. And then it gets passed on to the clinical operations team. And then it gets passed on to commercial, which is a whole other different ballgame. And we have a commercial team here also. And it's just a very different one way of doing business, two, the kind of people that you're working with, and three, what those outcomes are going to be. So our preclinical team, we're dealing with scientists. There's a lot of that data, and in the clinical operations team, we're dealing with people and how to make a process work, at scale. And so in the commercial team, it's a whole other different ballgame of regulatory guidelines and how you can communicate and promote new drugs and devices and such. So it is interesting. Coming into Simulations Plus, I wasn't as experienced on that preclinical space, and I still am not. Like I'm not a scientist at all. But moving and having to work with the teams and them trying to understand what we do, it's been interesting to understand that. Like to me, what we do on the proficiency side is so easy. Like, of course, this makes sense. But I think there is a degree of having to translate it in a different way now that I'm kind of familiar with how our other teams are consuming this content, how they're understanding what we do. So it's kind of changing language a little bit. Even just the term simulation, when they acquired us, simulation was very clearly defined as they are simulating data models. And then on our side, we're simulating experiences. So it's a great acquisition because we specialize in simulation-based training. So being acquired by Simulations Plus was a bit of a kismet moment, but it has been interesting because a lot of people will be like, "So what are you simulating?" Because they're just not used to our approach to things.
Now let's talk about that training for a second, because I don't think people realize in the life science vertical how much training we have to do on a regular basis and how much the auditors are looking for that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I talk to people a lot about IT in general, and everybody says, well, there's lots of good IT companies, and I agree. There's plenty of IT companies out there, really good IT companies. But one of the issues that they don't realize is that you have to show that your people are competent in what they're doing, so that from a data perspective, you can make sure that the data stays that it's incorruptible, that people haven't changed it, all the different things that are there. So having the training to show people about whether it's GDPR training, HIPAA training, 21 CFR Part 11, it could be just data loss prevention training, all those things that we deal with on the IT side. When I think about training on your side, when you think about clinical operations, you start to think about that kind of training. Talk a little bit more about the evolution of training in that area and what it used to be like and what you guys brought to the table from a proficiency perspective.
Yeah, when you think about like regulatory compliance requirements, before we really entered the space, which was I want to say about 8 years ago, and it's still even the predominant way of training is a PowerPoint deck, and we're talking about like 200-page PowerPoint decks at an IM or a virtual IM and an SIV, and there's a ton of in-person time. Now the limitations for that is one, when you're doing live training, there's a point in time where that training is viable. There's a lot of recording of that content and saying, we've sent it out to people. Studies will show in adult learning that is absolutely the worst way of training anyone is recorded content. It is highly likely that someone will play and walk away and do something else or get distracted with emails or, it's a read and acknowledge type situation where it proves that someone was present in it, but not that they were paying attention to it. And even with an investigator meeting, studies have shown that you have 5 to 10 minutes of attention until you are tuned out and thinking about other things. So we invest time and money and resources into these big meetings, and then we stand up in front of teams and we present 200-page PowerPoint slide decks. You have no evidence of someone's ability to really understand that they paid attention to it, and that they can apply that over time. And so that's something that's been missing in this space since the start. I think clinical research, and you've probably seen this too with a lot of the sessions that we tend to go to when we're at events, it's a very slow to change enterprise. And you're right about the technology issues that we experience here. We sit on the SCRS Cut 25 initiative where it talks about sites and training and such. And there was a stat, I think I'm going to get this sort of wrong, but I'm in the ballpark. It was like 40 to 60 hours or something like that per study per person for training, which is absurd if you think about how much time someone's spending in training. Keith, how much time have you spent this whole year on training?
I know.
I can count it on like 2 hands, and it's usually just internal like compliance training all year. But these sites are doing multiple studies. And then there's remediation training because inevitably they go to an IM and they take a whole bunch of hours of someone talking at them. They don't retain that information. They go, and then sponsors are finding out that sites aren't paying attention through deviations on their study. So they're in front of a patient making a mistake and they're like, the training didn't work. And then they reissue the training because from a regulatory perspective, you just have to show that you've done these things.
Right.
You don't necessarily have to show that you did it well until there's a CAPA. And then you have to show that you said that information, but you still don't have to show that someone understood it. So it's so backwards. We just keep pushing all of that downstream onto sites.
What's also so very interesting to me, when you think about clinical trials in general, and you think about the fact that we've got small molecule, we've got large molecule, we've got all these different things that are happening. If I'm dealing with somebody just taking a pill versus somebody that's going to have an infusion, and you start to think about the difference between the clinical needs of every different protocol. So one of the things you have to really look at is the protocol analysis and how we're dealing. I'm dealing with a global lab right now in a big project that we're doing, and just the variation in protocols is massive. And just trying to understand how does one protocol affected versus other protocols, and how do you deal with them? And to think about from a training perspective, everyone is it has its uniqueness because they all want to have certain level of how do you follow up with them? How do you do this? How do you inject this? What's the kit like? How do you deal with the kit? How do you put the kit together? All those different things. Talk about how the simulation kind of is good for that, and how I love the comment that you said. It's okay for them to fail when they're doing the simulation. That's what it's there for. You want it to fail then versus doing it with a patient.
Yeah, that little element there is something I talk to my clients often about, is that because it's inherent that most people, when they get into a learning enterprise, they want people to pass, like they want people to do well, because there's this whole testing mentality that we're brought up with, that if you go into an assessment, you want to perform really well. And I do find myself telling clients, like, the goal isn't that they're going to sail through. You don't want to make it easier for them. You want to make sure that you're meeting those learning criteria that you have within your protocol. Now, earlier, what you're talking about with, different learning needs for different studies, as well as for different people, like a KOL site that helped develop the protocol is going to need different learning than a research naive site that they just found, 6 months down the road as a backup site. Different learning needs. But that's where we apply that adaptive learning approach, to try to kind of keep it real short. We create a scenario, we let sites make a decision. If it's a protocol compliant decision, then they continue on through the module. They don't actually get a lot of training. We're just having them illustrate that they know how to apply this protocol. If they make a non-compliant decision, they get coaching specific to that non-compliant decision. So they're getting training tailored to what decisions they're making. The more mistakes they make, the more coaching they get, the more learning they receive. So those that are like a KOL site that help develop that protocol may spend, I don't know, depending how long the module is, like you say, how complex that protocol is, what we're trying to teach them about, could spend, let's say, 40 minutes in a module. And a site that's not familiar with the protocol, new to research, they're overworked, they might spend an hour and a half on that because they're getting so much coaching. And that's the way it should be. Those who need more learning receive more learning. But then, like what you're talking about with different complexities of the protocol, we have some programs that have like 15 modules in it. And we have some programs that have just a little eligibility module that takes 15 minutes to go through. It really depends on how complex that protocol is, what you need to make sure you're validating their learning on, and then what the risk areas are. So we work with our sponsor to make sure that we're getting the right learning for the right people at the right time. And I say the right time because there's some things like, let's take a rare disease study, for instance, where you might not see a patient for 6 months. You've got to make sure you have a trickle of information, because you can't expect someone to learn something in January and then not see a patient till July and remember all of that information. Right. We've got to make sure that they kind of continue to check in with what
I don't know how they could remember any of that, to be honest with you.
I wouldn't. They're busy. They're seeing patients.
Well, also, if you think about it, most of the sites that you're probably working with, they're probably working on multiple clinical trials. They have different protocols, different things going on. I don't know how.
Different eligibility criteria.
Give them credit. How do they all keep it straight? I don't know. So it would seem to me that having a novel way of doing training would help it stick more in your brain, and just that being able to go over and you have the coaching part of it as part of it. I've just recently, I just did some computer-based training, and it was, schmaltzy kind of training with stick figures and all this other stuff. But what I also found out was that if I not only listened to it, but if I read it as it was going through it, it just, to me, I'm a visual learner and I want to take in as many different ways of thinking about it so that it'll stick with me. I actually disagree with some of the answers that were correct. I would go opposite some of the things, but saying, well, you're not thinking about this account or that account or things like so. But I understand how to answer some of those questions. You got to answer them anyway, and you just got to get your 75% or higher, and you're good to go. All kind of things. So but I love the approach. I love the approach you guys take. I love the concept that's there. Do you think that what you guys are doing has actually helped Simulations Plus look at the world a little bit differently from their aspect in the other industries that they're in?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that it's having them look at things differently. I think they're seeing that there's an opportunity to continue to support our clients in a more kind of holistic fashion across that kind of lifespan of a protocol, from development through to operations, through even to that commercial space. So I do still think that they see the value of the science that they're delivering. And that's held true. And they do really good work on the science side. I say we should say we, but I'm not smart enough to do the science that they do. Anyway.
Interesting. So do you have any good stories about your simulation, any particular trials that you've done or anything like that, where the training has really, people have said that it was it made the difference in everything they were doing or something?
Yeah. Oh God, I have loads of those. We got back from Scope last week, and for the second year in a row, we were having sites that were coming to find us and say, thank you for really good, training. We enjoyed that so much more. We ask evaluation questions at the end of every single one of our modules. And I mentioned the GCP program that we do for SCRS. I know as a fact from my 16 years at ACRP that GCP is the most hated of all of the courses in clinical research, but we still get like a 98% satisfaction score on our GCP program. I say this, it's free. Anyone can take it. So we make no money off of this thing, but if you want a good GCP course, go to SCRS and grab it. It's a really good one. But from a client perspective, one of the things I love about what we do is that we get to be a part of so many really interesting studies, really innovative studies that are changing human health and the human condition. It's fascinating. One of the studies we helped with, and they presented with us at Scope a couple of years ago, is with a company called ProKidney. And when we were able to look at some of the data, and I have a case study that we've published about this one, that there's an injection procedure where when you do the injection, it causes this blood pressure to drop. And in normal standard of care, you would pull out of that injection, and this would be a situation you need to remedy. But if you do that in this study, you're going to lose the IP, and the IP is incredibly expensive. So we needed to do a couple of case studies on that one. And what we found is that we did the initial training after the first investigator meeting, kind of right after that. And when they came through, the proceduralists were doing our simulation, and 86% had gotten that scenario wrong. They had said, cease the injection and move out. That's a problem, because that was going to cost the sponsor a ton of money. And we had the kind of, nobody wants their study delayed, but we had the opportunity, I should say, of that study being delayed for about 6 months. So we were able to reissue another kind of scenario, change some of the parameters, change the chart for the patient that we were using as an example, and had the proceduralist do it again. And it was the absolute inverse. 86% had answered that correctly. And that's 6 months later. They hadn't been able to do the injection yet, but we found that they were able to retain that information over time and answer it appropriately. Even though in the investigator meeting, the first time they had just heard the information, which illustrates the investigator meeting is not where learning happens. Right. It's where conversation should be happening. But they had just heard that, and they did ours and they got it wrong. So the simulation, when it's, they talk about in marketing, mass customization. Everyone wants that. Everyone wants something meant for them. And that's what we're able to give them in this training. They get to do the training at a time when they're mentally ready to do the training, at a time when they're ready to digest it, and at a pace that they can control, unlike live learning. So it's really impactful.
I think this is fantastic. We're coming up on time, Jenna. This has been a great conversation. I loved having this. I'd love to have you back at some point in the future, as you guys come up with new products, new different things that you're doing out there. But as a final thought, tell us a little bit more about what's your final thoughts for people out there thinking about using simulations, particularly in the clinical setting?
Oh, I mean, I think the biggest thing is, and I had a colleague that would always say, pay me now or pay me later. It's so easy in the start of a clinical trial to be like, well, we'll just do what we've always done. But then it causes backlogs and issues. And, you've got data quality, patient safety, regulatory compliance that are at risk if you don't start right. And we've got an ROI calculator that can really help illustrate how right this is. And we can customize it per study. But it's just really worthwhile to think a little differently in this space, because this is when we're in this kind of human contact element of clinical trials where we have sites direct with patients. We have to get that right. And we cannot risk our first batch of patients having it done wrong. If you can just get one more patient in earlier, one more patient having procedures done correctly, it can be invaluable for a study, and we can help with that. So we're all about getting it right the first time.
Fantastic. Again, this has been the Driving the Business of Science podcast. We've just illustrated another area where, from a perspective of developing the drug and doing something with the drug, we're not there. We're actually talking about teaching how to administer something as part of a process. And I think that it's those kind of things that people don't realize when people talk about how expensive it is to do drugs and set, create new drugs and bring them to market. These are all part of it. It's things like this that are going to help to minimize that cost issue or minimize the issues of of pulling out early on that one study you were talking about, things like that. So love the conversation. Jenna, you've been awesome. Look forward to seeing you. Hopefully I'll see you in, maybe it's Orlando, the next one that we're maybe going to be at.
Yeah,
I
I
don't know
think
if we're going
so.
to be there or not. So
Yeah. Thank you, Keith, for having me. I really appreciate it. It's always a delight to talk to you.
sounds good. Take care, Jenna.
Take
Bye,
care.
guys.
Bye.